A starving little girl with nothing but a broken doll crossed paths with a man the world thought untouchable. What happened next will move you forever. Watch till the end. Hit like, subscribe, and share this story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The drizzle had ended only minutes before, leaving the air damp and the cracked asphalt slick with a thin sheen. County Road 17 stretched out lonely and silent, the kind of road where people rarely stopped unless something forced them to. For Grace Miller, 6 years old and already carrying the weight of a world that ignored her, this road was both her path and her prison. Her small sneakers slapped against the pavement as she walked aimlessly, her tattered hoodie hanging loose, sleeves frayed and damp from the rain. In her arms she carried the only thing she could call her own, a broken doll with button eyes and torn fabric that had long since lost its color. She clutched it against her chest the way other children held their parents' hands, as though the fragile toy might keep her anchored in a world that barely noticed she existed. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a sharp, constant reminder of the days without a full meal. But worse than the hunger was the hollow ache in her chest, the emptiness that came from being unseen. She was invisible to most who passed her. People turned their faces away when they saw a little girl alone. To them, she was either a problem or a scam, another stray child lost in the shadows of the city. Grace had learned not to expect kindness. She wandered, quiet and unnoticed, her world reduced to scraps of food and fleeting shelter. But fate has a way of shifting when least expected. As she rounded a bend in the road, her steps faltered. A glint of twisted metal caught her eye, gleaming faintly under the fading light of dusk. For a heartbeat, she thought it was just another piece of junk left behind. But then she saw it fully. A motorcycle, crumpled on its side, chrome bent in unnatural angles, smoke rising in thin curls from the engine. Her chest tightened as her gaze fell to the ground beside it. A man lay sprawled across the wet pavement, his body broken in ways her young mind struggled to understand. One leg bent sharply, wrong at the knee, his leather jacket ripped open across the shoulder. A gash ran across his forehead, blood dripping steadily into the dirt. His chest rose and fell, but barely. Grace froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear clawed at her, telling her to run back to the diner she had passed miles earlier, run to the safety of lights and people. But her sneakers rooted to the ground. The faint groan that escaped his lips locked her in place. It wasn't just the sound of pain. It was a plea, raw and human, that seemed meant for her alone. Step by trembling step, she moved closer. The doll dug into her ribs as she hugged it tight, as though the fabric shield might protect her from the horror in front of her. Kneeling awkwardly beside him, she reached out with shaking hands. She didn't know what to do. She had never seen so much blood before, but instinct told her she couldn't leave him. Her oversized sleeve, ragged at the edges, became her bandage. She pressed it against the gash on his forehead, her small hand trembling as crimson spread across the fabric. The man's eyelids fluttered, and then his eyes opened halfway. Even blurred with pain, they were startlingly blue. His lips parted, and a sound like broken glass escaped. "Stay. Don't leave." The words cracked in the air, fragile and desperate. Grace's throat tightened. Nobody had ever begged her for anything before. She had always been the one begging for scraps, for shelter, for a second glance. "I'm here, mister," she whispered, voice trembling but firm. "I'll help." Her sleeve grew darker with blood. She wanted to scream for someone, anyone, but the road was empty. The fields stretched silent around them, indifferent to her small struggle. The weight of it pressed down on her. She was the only one, standing between this man and the darkness pulling him away. Her doll slipped from her grasp, tumbling into the grass, forgotten for the first time. Both hands pressed against the wound, though her strength was nothing compared to the flow she tried to stop. She clenched her teeth, sweat trickling down her forehead. Then his hand moved, slow, deliberate, yet shockingly strong. His fingers closed around her wrist. She flinched, but the touch was steady enough to pause her panic. His lips formed words again, weaker this time, but carrying a weight that carved itself into her memory. "Angel, you came." The word struck her deeper than any kindness she had ever known. No one had ever called her that. Not at the orphanage, where she was little more than a shadow. Not on the streets, where she was invisible. Angel. The syllable burned into her heart, brighter than the neon signs she chased for. Warmth. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. "Don't close your eyes. Please, don't." But his eyelids sagged. His breath grew shallow, each inhale thinner than the last. Panic surged inside her. She couldn't fix broken bones, couldn't stop the blood, but she could do something. She could run. She could find help. Clutching his hand tight, she bent low and whispered fiercely into his ear. "I'll come back, I swear." For a moment, his fingers squeezed faintly around hers, the smallest spark of acknowledgement. It was enough. She scrambled to her feet, snatched her doll from the grass, and sprinted down the road. The cracked pavement stretched endless under her pounding sneakers. Each step was a vow, each breath a promise. She wouldn't abandon him, not like the world had abandoned her. Ahead, the buzzing glow of neon cut through the deepening dusk. Dot's diner sat at the roadside, its checkered floor and chrome stools visible through the glass windows. The smell of frying bacon and hot coffee hit her as soon as she burst through the door, nearly tripping over her own feet. Heads turned, conversation stilled. Grace's chest heaved as she fought to form words. "Please," she gasped. "There's a man. He crashed his bike. He's bleeding so much. He needs help." For a long, unbearable moment, silence filled the diner. An elderly couple blinked in confusion. A truck driver shook his head, muttering, "Scam." A waitress froze, her notepad suspended midair. Grace's face burned with shame. She clutched her doll against her chest as though it could shield her from their disbelief. But then, remembering the blue eyes clouded with pain, she forced her voice louder, desperate. "I'm not lying. He's dying out there. Please, believe me." The raw honesty in her tone cracked through the silence. Still, no one moved. Then, at the counter, a young clerk set down the coffee pot in his hand. Eli Brooks, barely out of high school, stepped forward. His gaze locked on the trembling child with the broken doll. Something in her eyes, fear, determination, made him trust her. "Where is he, kid?" he asked gently. Grace's chest heaved with relief. She pointed back down the road, trembling. "By the curve. His bike's broken. His leg." She stopped, unable to finish. The memory was too sharp. Eli didn't hesitate. Pulling a phone from his apron, he dialed for an ambulance. "Show me," he urged, shrugging into his jacket. Grace nodded fiercely, wiping tears from her face. Her promise wasn't broken yet. Together, they pushed out into the night. Their strides were mismatched. His long, steady, hers short and frantic, but they shared the same urgency. The quiet road awaited, carrying with it the man who had called her angel and the promise she refused to break. Dot's diner had the kind of light that made everything look a little too honest. Fluorescents buzzed, coffee hissed from the pot. The chrome edges of the counter threw back the long room in strips. Grace stood in the doorway gulping air, rain freckling her hoodie, doll pressed to her chest like a life preserver, words tangled in her throat until she shoved them out. "Please, there's a man on the road. He crashed his bike. He's bleeding. Please." For a second, the room froze on a single frame. Forks hovered. A napkin drifted to the floor. Then the soundtrack of adult skepticism kicked in. A scoff near the pie case, a sigh from the corner booth. A trucker tipped his cap back and muttered, "Seen this grift 100 times." A lady in pearls clucked her tongue, the kind of sound that says she pities everything without touching any of it. Even the waitress, Marge, with a pencil tucked behind her ear, halted mid-scribble. Heat crawled up Grace's neck. She hadn't meant to cry, but tears pushed anyway, blurring the neon open sign into a bleeding smear. She was used to being doubted, but not tonight, not with his blood drying on her sleeve. She lifted the doll higher and tried again, voice cracking open. "I'm not lying. He needs help. He's dying." Behind the counter, a young clerk set down the coffee pot as if he'd just realized his hands were shaking. Eli Brooks. A few pimples still clung to his jaw, a name tag with a crooked pin. He studied her like people do when they want the truth more than they want to be right. "Where?" he asked. Relief hit so hard it made her knees wobble. "By the curve," she said, pointing towards the smear of dusk beyond the glass. His bike smashed, his leg. The image punched the breath out of her. She couldn't say it out loud. Eli was already in motion. He shrugged on a jacket, shouldered the door with his hip, and with his free hand dialed 911. "Dot's Diner, County Road 17, he said into the phone as they burst into the wet air. "Motorcycle wreck. One victim, male, conscious but fading. Head laceration, possible femur fracture. Yes, we're on foot, half a mile west of the bend." He listened, nodded, then met Grace's eyes. "You're leading." "Ready?" She nodded, though her lungs felt like paper bags crumpling and opening. They ran. Their strides didn't match. His long, steady, hers a choppy cadence of urgency and fear. But they found a rhythm anyway. The road curved, throwing up the wreck like a bad memory. The bike lay on its side, a pool of gasoline making rainbows in the shallow ditch. The man, still there, thank God, breathed in small, uneven pulls. Eli dropped to a knee beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" He put the phone back to his ear. "We've got him. He's altered but responsive." He flattened his hand near the man's jaw, counting breaths he didn't say aloud. "We're keeping him still." To Grace, he said, "You did right. You kept pressure." She showed her sleeve, stiff now. "It wouldn't stop." "Doesn't have to stop," Eli said, "just has to slow." He squeezed her shoulder once, quick and sure. "You hold his hand, talk to him. I'll keep airway and bleed control." Grace slid around to the other side, knees soaking in the chill from the pavement. The man's eyes fluttered, fighting the kind of sleep that doesn't let go. Up close, his face looked both older and younger than she'd first thought. Older in the lines at the corners of his eyes, younger in the uncertainty etched there now. She tucked her doll under her arm so both hands were free and took his fingers in hers. "I came back," she whispered. "I promised." His gaze found her, slowly, as if cutting through fog, and stayed. Something eased in it. "Angel," he breathed, and the word steadied her hands better than any instruction could have. Eli tore a strip from a clean towel he'd swiped on instinct from the diner and pressed it against the wound at the hairline, firm and sure. "Sirens inbound," he said, more to keep everyone's courage up than to inform. "You hang with us, okay? Don't go anywhere." A thin sound that might have been a laugh pulled at the man's mouth. His fingers shifted in Grace's palm. She felt the tremor run through him and clamped down gently, matching the pressure to the tiny pulse she could feel at his wrist. Red washed the world before the sound fully arrived. lights splashing over wet blacktop, over the bent chrome and the oil-slicked ditch. The ambulance fishtailed slightly, braked true, and stilled with a deep mechanical exhale. 2 EMTs hit the ground moving. Ramirez stitched over one pocket, Chen over the other. "Talk to me," Ramirez said, already gloving up. Eli relayed, crisp, mechanism of injury, mental status, visible trauma, time since discovery. Chen's hands flew, C-collar, O2, another clean dressing. The efficiency felt like a kind of mercy. Grace kept herself small, out of the way, but near enough that the man could still find her if he looked. He did. Between tape and gauze and beeps, his eyes swung to her, clung, drifted, returned, as if he were taking bearings and kept choosing the same star. "Sir," Ramirez said, "we're going to move you. You're doing fine." To Grace, softer. "You with him when we load?" She nodded, throat thick. "Please." They rolled him in a clean, practiced pivot, slid the backboard, strapped, lifted. He groaned, then bit it down, a sound that made Grace feel helpless in a way that turned in her chest like a key. Eli stepped back to give room, the way good helpers do. At the ambulance doors, the man lifted his head a fraction, face gray under the rig's LEDs. He found her again. The world narrowed to the line between their eyes, rain ticking on the rig's roof. "Find me," he said, barely a whisper, and it punched through the chaos with the force of a vow. Grace nodded, so hard it hurt. "I will. I promise." Ramirez guided her a step back. "We've got him." To Eli, "Ride-alongs, not an option tonight. We're taking him to county. Level 1. You two did good." The doors shut. The siren rose, one long, falling note that left everything quieter than before. The ambulance shrank down the straightaway until its tail lights bled into the dark. The sudden stillness pressed on the scene. The bike ticked as it cooled. Somewhere beyond the trees a dog barked twice and gave up. Gasoline still rainbowed in the ditch. Grace stared down the road as if she could will the red points back into view. The emptiness that followed help felt bigger than the empty that had come before it. Eli exhaled hard, shoving both hands through his hair. "Okay," he said, mostly to calibrate himself back to a reality that included next steps. He crouched to Grace's height. "You saved his life, kid." She didn't look away from where the siren had gone. "What if he... The word died in her mouth. "He's got a shot because of you?" Eli's voice found a register that didn't talk down to her. "You did everything right. You heard me tell dispatch. You held pressure, you kept him awake. Sometimes help is 3 minutes of stubborn. You had that." The rain had turned to mist. It haloed the diner's sign, made the letters buzz like bees. A second responder truck rolled by slow, lights turning without siren, and kept going toward the bend and the debris they'd left behind. The world, greedy as ever, already wanted the road back. They walked to the diner without talking much. Inside, sound surged back in predictable waves. Forks, sizzles, voices pitched too high to hide what they'd been saying. Marge hustled a towel to Grace's hands and a glass of milk to her place at the counter. The milk smelled like a memory of kitchens Grace didn't like to visit in her mind. She drank anyway. Hunger was a bossy ghost. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marge asked, softer than before. "Grace," she said, the word coming out like a dare and a plea all at once. "Of course it is," Marge murmured, not quite under her breath. Someone 2 stools down said, "If that man's who they say he is, there's going to be a reward." Someone else answered, "Or a lawsuit." The laughter that followed was the dry, papery kind. Grace slid off the stool as if the vinyl had burned her. Eli caught her eye, shook his head once. "Don't let them set the story." He lifted the pass-through, came around the counter, and knelt to her height again. "Ambulance will hit county in 10, he said. "You can't go with them, but we can call and check." He hesitated, then held out his hand, palm up, not assuming. "You okay to hang here a while?" Grace looked at the door, at the road, at the little clock with a biscuit company logo that swore it was almost 8. If she left, she'd be alone with the siren's echo. If she stayed, she'd be alone with people who didn't know what had happened in the rain. She put her hand in his anyway. Eli guided her to a back booth. The seat creaked. Marge slid over a grilled cheese that was still glossy at the edges and a bowl of tomato soup that cupped steam like a secret. "Eat," she said. "Doctor's orders." When Grace blinked, she added, "I was married to one for 23 years. Close enough." Grace ate small, careful bites, as if the food might be snatched back at any second. Between mouthfuls, she watched the window. The road curved away, a dark question mark drawing trouble to its dot. The promise she'd made at the ambulance doors lodged in her throat like a stone. "Find me." It pulsed there with her heartbeat. Eli made 2 phone calls, one to the hospital. "HIPAA, I get it. I just need to know if he arrived," and one to his manager. "Yeah, I'm staying late. It's not a thing. I'll close up." He returned with a nod that took some of the fizz out of Grace's panic. "He's there," he said. "They used words like stable for now." "That's hospital for we're doing our jobs." She exhaled, a sound she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. Relief didn't erase fear. It layered over it, thin but real. "Can I—" She swallowed. "Can I go see him?" Eli glanced at the door, at the rain, at the truth. "Tonight? They won't let you in." He didn't dress it up. "Tomorrow we'll try the desk, bring names, details. You were there. We'll make them hear you." She nodded once, a soldier's nod on a child's face. The booth's vinyl squeaked again when she shifted. Rust streaked her shoelaces where the roadside had bled into her. She smoothed the doll's worn yarn hair with her thumb and pressed her lips to its fabric ear. "He called me Angel," she said, as if that single word could oxygenate a whole lung. Eli's mouth tilted. "Seems accurate." The diner thinned out, the trucker paid with cash, over-tipped out of guilt, and left. The Pearls lady pretended not to watch Grace as she boxed her pie to go. The clock coughed up minutes. Marge dimmed the front half of the room, flipped chairs on tables on the far side, left the booth lights warm. When Grace stood to leave, the rain had softened to a hush. The road had washed itself a shade cleaner, though nothing about it felt clean. Standing in the doorway, she looked back at Eli. "I'll be here," he said. "And tomorrow, if you want, I'll walk you to the desk. Make them hear you." She swallowed and nodded. The doll's button eyes caught a slice of neon. For a second, they gleamed like something alive. Outside, the air smelled like damp gravel and gasoline. Grace followed the sidewalk to the little park that faced the hospital like a supplicant. The lamp post she'd claimed the night before buzzed its tired insect song. Rusty slunk out from the bushes, tail flicking an uncertain greeting. "You hungry?" she asked. She split the last corner of grilled cheese she'd hidden in her sleeve. He took it from her palm, warm tongue quick and grateful, then lay at her sneakers with a sigh that might have been contentment. Across the street, ambulances slid in and out of the bay with the indifferent grace of sharks. Automatic doors inhaled and exhaled people. Nurses with hair up and heads down, families holding flowers the color of apology, security guards, practicing soft nose they'd have to harden by midnight. Grace tucked her knees into her hoodie and made herself small on the bench, the doll under her chin, Rusty's heat a slow blanket over her shoes. She tried to pray and, finding no words for it, made promises instead. She promised she would go back in the morning. She promised she would say the words that mattered and not the ones that made adults roll their eyes. She promised she would remember the siren's pitch, the way his hand had felt in hers, the way the world had paused when he said, "Find me." She dozed in patches. The night stitched itself together around her, snatches of ambulance chatter, the low growl of far-off trucks, the delicate tap of water loosening from the lamplight. She woke once with her cheek cold from the bench and said aloud, to prove she still could, "I'm coming back." Somewhere in a room she couldn't reach, men and women she would never meet pushed carts and buttons and numbers that measured breath. Somewhere between the numbers, a man with a split scalp and a broken leg fell toward sleep and was caught by steady hands. Somewhere under that sleep, a word waited. Angel. When morning bleached color back into the world, her bones hurt. She stood, wincing, stretching the stiffness out of her calves. Rusty shook himself as if surprised to still be there. The hospital's glass threw the sky back with the easy arrogance of buildings that get cleaned at dawn. The automatic doors breathed in another day of stories. Grace tightened her grip on the doll and stepped off the curb. She would try the main entrance first. If that failed, she would try again. She didn't know the words for jurisdiction or policy. She knew how to keep a promise until it opened something that looked like a door. Behind her, the diner's neon blinked awake one letter at a time. O, then P, then E, as if the last N would arrive whenever it felt like it. Ahead, the revolving doors took in strangers and gave them back. She squared her shoulders, small as she was, and walked toward them, the vow from the back of an ambulance riding like a second heartbeat in her chest. The hospital's revolving doors turned with a hush that felt like a warning. Grace waited until a cluster of visitors stepped in, then slid close behind them, small enough to disappear inside the fold of their coats. Antiseptic air hit her tongue, sharp and clean, nothing like the wet metal smell of the road. For a breath, she let herself imagine that getting through the glass meant she belonged. "Sweetheart," a voice said, not unkind, "hold up." The security desk sat like a checkpoint just beyond the lobby's shine. The same guard from last night, Nate Thompson, badge catching the morning light, stood and came around, palms open to show he wasn't going to grab. It didn't make it easier. "Where are your folks?" he asked. "You can't be wandering round in here." Grace cinched her broken doll tighter into the crook of her arm. "I'm here to see him," she said, willing the words to sound like permission. "The man from the road. I found him." She swallowed. "He told me to find him?" Nate's eyes softened, then hardened again under the weight of policy. "I'm sure you helped," he said, "but ICU has rules. Can't let anyone back without a guardian or clearance." "I have a name," she tried. "He called me—" She stopped because Angel felt like something you hide from strangers, like a secret too bright for a room this white. He said not to leave. "Tell you what," Nate said, voice lowering. "You give me your name. I'll pass it along at the desk. If somebody asks for you, I'll come find you at the front." He waited, pen hovering. "Grace," she said. It came out small. He wrote it down carefully, as if careful letters could build a bridge. Then he walked her back toward the doors with more gentleness than authority usually bothers to show. "I'm not trying to be mean," he added. "It's just the rules." The glass folded her out again. The morning wind slipped under her hoodie like a hand looking for a pocket to empty. Across the drop-off lane, a news van idled. A reporter practiced her serious face into a phone, then reset and practiced again. Grace stood very still until she knew what to do next. "Try again." She circled the building, counting doors in silence. An employee entrance gaped for a second while a delivery cart rattled through. Grace darted, sneakers whispering over the threshold, heartbeat loud enough to make the corridor echo. She didn't get 10 steps. A nurse, with tired eyes and a coffee cup gripped like a weapon, nearly collided with her. "Hey there," the nurse said, steadying the cup and then the child in front of her. "Where are you supposed to be?" "With him," Grace blurted. "The man from the accident. I promised. He told me to find him." The nurse's mouth tugged at one corner. Not a smile, not a frown. Something like compassion pressed thin. "Promises matter," she said softly, then sighed. "But so do rules." Her hand hovered toward the wall phone. "Please," Grace said, the words scraping. "He'll forget me if I can't get in." The nurse glanced at the laminated poster of policy taped above the phone, then at the small fist holding a broken doll. It took a full beat before she reached for the receiver anyway. "Security to East Service," she said. "We've got a lost little one." Nate again. He'd walked faster this time, as if speed could make this less like it felt. "Kiddo," he said, crouching to her level. "You can't keep sneaking. I told the front desk. If he or someone asks for you, we'll know where to look, I promise." "They never believe me," she said. He hesitated. "Some of us do." Then the rules spoke again, and he guided her back outside. The second rejection landed harder than the first. Grace sat on the concrete steps and watched automatic doors breathe strangers in and out and in, swallowing and returning stories that weren't hers. She rested her cheek on her doll's button head until it hurt enough to feel like staying. By midday, the curb filled with cameras. The city had learned a name: Alexander Sterling. Anchors said it the way people say a password they know will open other doors. Tech icon. Philanthropist. Sterling Labs founder. Strangers practiced sounding like they had always cared. Grace stood at the edge of the sidewalk where nobody would think to shoo her because nobody thought to see her. A man selling papers slapped headlines onto metal racks and slid bills into a belt pouch. The front page showed red flashing against wet pavement. EMTs braced around a stretcher. In the bottom corner, a blur of a child crouched near a stranger's hand, yarn hair and button eyes caught by the camera's glare. "Tech billionaire saved by mystery child," the headline said. "Identity unknown." She stared until the ink might have bled onto her fingers if ink still bled like it used to. People leaned in to look, then leaned back to comment as if they were auditioning for something. "If that kid lands on TV, the foster check writes itself," someone said. "PR stunt," another answered. "Guy like that, they script the sunlight." "Either way," a third voice offered, the kind that enjoyed being right more than being kind. "A stray like that won't set foot upstairs." Grace folded around her doll as if she could make both of them smaller than the words. The photo had caught her there. 6 square inches of proof. It wasn't enough to belong. It was just enough to be doubted louder. She crossed the street and found the little municipal park the city pretended was a plaza by giving it 2 benches and a trash can. The lamppost there buzzed like it had slept badly. Rusty trotted out from under the shrubs, his ribs counting the same slow truth they had the night before. He nosed her knee and sat as if he'd been saving the spot. "I tried," she told him. "Twice." He huffed and set his chin on her shoe like an answer. She watched the hospital across the lane the way sailors used to watch lighthouses, with a hunger that wasn't for food. Nurses moved in flurries at shift change, badges flashing, hair tucked tight, shoes that knew your bones. Orderlies pushed carts with their own quiet dignity. The door breathed the city in and out. A pair of women with gym bags paused near the bench, voices pitched to Carrie. "They say it's Alexander himself," one said. "My husband's cousin did a contract at Sterling Labs, stock options that bought them a cabin." "Did you see the photo?" the other asked. "There's a kid in it, little ragamuffin thing. They haven't found her." "They will if they want to," the first said. "People like him, everything bends." Their words drifted away, trailing the scent of citrus detergent and certainty. Grace traced the seam of her doll's arm with her thumb as if following a map. She didn't know where it was supposed to lead, only that she had to keep walking it. By late afternoon, the light flattened to the kind that makes everything honest. A volunteer rolled a cart of flowers toward the front doors. Petals shivered in a gust like they'd heard the same bad joke twice. A janitor swung a mop along the curb where someone had spilled coffee and left a ring like a small eclipse. The city kept moving. That was its talent. Grace crossed back toward the entry at exactly the same moment a small family emerged. A mother wiping mascara with the edge of her sleeve, a boy whose baseball cap sat crooked with worry, a grandfather blinking too fast. People went in hurting and came out changed or didn't. The doors never told. She tried the main desk again because trying was the point. This time, the woman behind the counter had curls pinned with glittering clips shaped like leaves. Her name tag read Ava. When she looked up and met Grace's eyes, she didn't flinch. "I need to see." "Him," Grace said before nerves could twist language. "From the motorcycle. I found him." Ava's eyes flicked to the security desk, then back. "What's your name?" she asked. "Grace." Ava typed it into a field that probably wasn't built for that kind of name. She waited, lips pressed together, then said softly, "If someone asks for you, we'll know you were here." She slid a peppermint across the counter, the way nurses pass both time and comfort. "That's the best I can do." "Thank you," Grace said. She didn't take the peppermint until she'd stepped away, as if accepting it meant accepting the limits, too. Outside, the reporter with the practiced serious face stood before a camera, posture perfect. "Few questions remain," she said, earpiece glowing. "Who is the child in the photo? Where did she go? For now, the only certainty is that Alexander Sterling remains in critical but stable condition at County." "Critical but stable," Grace repeated silently, tasting each word like a code. She tucked the peppermint into her hoodie pocket for later. She would eat it when the day turned meaner. By evening, she drifted back to Dot's diner because rooms with warm light promise things their food doesn't always deliver. The bell over the door clanged and the chatter dimmed a notch the way it does when new facts enter an old story. Marge caught sight of her and, without commentary, poured cocoa into a thick white mug. Eli looked up from the register and lifted 2 fingers in the question that meant everything okay. She dipped her chin, as okay as it gets. "Any news?" he asked when the edge of the counter gave them privacy that wasn't really privacy. "They won't let me in," she said. "They wrote my name." "That's a start," he said. When she didn't answer, he added, "I called for what it's worth. They won't tell a stranger anything, but he's there. Still there." Marge set a plate near her elbow without making a show of it. Pancakes at supper time, butter softening into a gloss. "On the house," she said, eyes pretending to be busy with the sugar caddy. "Carbs help with waiting." Grace ate slow, ritual neat, as if neatness could buy dignity. At the far booth, the trucker from last night pretended to read the sports section and not watch her. The Pearls lady didn't come back. A college kid in scrubs studied flashcards and inhaled fries. Life stacked itself into pages people could flip. "Kid," the trucker said finally, not unkind, "paper says the guy's a billionaire. If he wants you found, he'll find you." Grace's fork paused above her plate. "People don't always do what they say," she answered, not looking up. "Fair," he said after a beat. He went back to the scores, chastened by a verdict the size of a whisper. When the plates were empty and the cocoa had left a ring she tried to wipe with her sleeve, Eli slid a napkin under the mug and said, "Leave it. Makes us look like a place where people actually eat." He walked her to the door and squinted at the sky. "Rain again," he said. "It's like the weather's stuck on a thought." The lamppost heard him and buzzed agreement. Rusty materialized from nowhere and everywhere at once, tail swishing in a low arc. Grace sat on the bench, and he curled into the bowl her sneakers made, a perfect fit put together by accident and need. Across the street, a helicopter thumped and drifted, heading toward the river where the sky kept the city's stories to itself. Night settled early out here, in the part of town that didn't buy extra daylight with glass. The hospital's windows lifted their own constellations. Grace kept her vigil the way children know how to keep things, stubbornly, with untrained faith, measuring time by the tide of pain in their chest rather than the clock. She whispered to the doll because talking to something felt like not disappearing. "They called me a mystery," she said, "but I'm not. I'm Grace." She let the name sit on her tongue until it warmed. He said, "Find me." And I did. I keep doing it. The wind pushed drizzle under the hem of her hoodie. She pulled it tighter. A couple in matching joggers passed, arguing softly about dinner, taxes, whether they should call his mother more. A paramedic from earlier walked out of the bay laughing at something on his phone and then tucked the laugh away when he noticed the bench and what it held. He raised a hand. She raised one back. It felt like a kind of permission. Later, when the hour had stripped the block of most movement, she stood and crossed to the front doors one more time, because some nights you have to check that a lock is still a lock. Nate looked up, saw her, and didn't stand. He tipped 2 fingers off his brow as if acknowledging a comrade in a long, boring campaign. "Nothing yet," he called, softly across the lobby. "But the list has your name." "Okay," she said. It was one word, but it contained a night's worth of promises. She turned and went back to the bench. Rusty resettled with a huff that said he knew this routine now. At the newsstand, the stack of papers had thinned to a few copies, edges fanning from where hands had pinched and pulled. On a TV mounted high in a corner of the lobby, an anchor with very white teeth recapped the same footage with the same words. "Mystery child. Heroic act. Unanswered questions." Grace pressed her palm flat over the doll's threadbare torso and looked up at the hospital as if it were a mountain she might climb by naming each step. "I'm not a question," she said quietly. "I'm the answer he asked for." Sometime after midnight, a janitor came out and hosed the curb where the day had left its mark. Water sheeted into the gutter with a sound like someone shushing a crowd that wouldn't quiet. The peppermint in her pocket had softened with the heat of her palm. She unwrapped it, put it on her tongue, and decided it tasted like staying. When the sky began to pale, when delivery trucks started their low growl and the coffee places blinked their signs awake, Grace stood and shook the stiffness from her knees. Her bones felt older than 6. Rusty stretched and sneezed twice, ceremonial. She touched the doll's button eye like a superstition and faced the doors again. "Not yet," the morning said, but something in the way the light landed on the glass felt different, like the moment just before a held breath breaks. She wasn't welcome. Not yet. But the day had moved, and so had she, and sometimes moving is the only proof you have that the door will eventually open. She squared her shoulders, small, defiant, and walked toward the revolving glass to try again. carrying her promise the way other people carried briefcases and coffee, something they could not begin without. By late afternoon, the media had turned the hospital sidewalk into a parade route. Boom mics hovered. Tripods spidered across the curb. Camera lights bleached the color out of the hedges. Inside, the elevators sighed and chimed, running executives, surgeons, and roomers between floors. Victoria Langford moved through all of it with the sleek efficiency of a person who was always, everywhere, exactly where she meant to be. Her phone never stopped humming. She flicked through updates with a thumb that never trembled. Board members needing assurance. Attorneys reminding her of statements scrubbed of liability. A foundation director asking if this incident could anchor a fundraising gala in 6 months. She answered each in a sentence, the way you drop pins on a map for later, but under the stacked calm of her voice ran a single thread, tugging, insistent. Find the child. Alexander hadn't said much since surgery, pain management wrapped language in cotton, but the words he did spend, he spent on the girl, the one who didn't leave. His mind, methodical even through fog, had fixed on a single bright point. She's real, he had said, not looking at Victoria, staring somewhere just over her shoulder as if the memory stood there, steadying him. She held on. Victoria knew him well enough to listen when he rarely insisted. Years at his right hand had taught her to separate the noise that swelled around someone like Alexander from the handful of notes that mattered. If he said a little girl saved his life, then she existed. And if she existed, Victoria would find her. At the nurse's station, she asked first, "A child? 6, maybe 7? Brown hair, tangled. Small, holding a doll, would have tried to get upstairs." Heads shook, faces apologetic. A volunteer thought she'd glimpsed a kid at the front doors earlier, but security had handled it. Victoria thanked them, meant it, and took the next step the way you step down a familiar staircase in the dark, knowing where the risers are by memory. The front desk clerk, Ava, leaf-shaped clips catching the light, looked up when Victoria approached. "I'm looking for a little girl," Victoria said, "named Grace. She may have given it to you earlier." Ava typed, scanned, nodded. "She came by," Ava said. "Security has her on a look-for list. Couldn't let her back." There was apology and a hint of quiet defiance in the way she said it, as if she were sorry for the rules and proud she'd left a breadcrumb anyway. "Thank you," Victoria said, sliding a card across the desk. "If she returns and I'm not standing here, call me." She stepped outside into air that carried the smell of damp concrete and camera heat. A reporter turned toward her, eyes bright with the scent of proximity to power. "Miss Langford," she began, but Victoria was already moving, the word glancing off the plane of her face as if she'd been designed to deflect it. Hospitals keep their own weather. Across the street, Dot's diner glowed with the kind of neon that pretends to be warm and then proves it is. Victoria pushed through the door and paused just long enough to collect the room's entire story. The trucker pretending not to listen, the nursing student inhaling fries, the waitress who ran the place by gravity and the force of her attention. Behind the counter stood a young man with a name tag that read Ely, a coffee pot in one hand, a wariness in his eyes that said he would not be impressed by people merely because they arrived in expensive coats. "You were on County Road 17 last night?" she asked, voice pitched low for him alone. No preamble. She reached into her folder and placed a photo on the laminate. Alexander, pale but conscious, a strip of white across his hairline where gauze had been, his eyes open in that particular way people's eyes open after near-miss mornings. Eli's jaw went tight, then eased. "That the guy?" he said. It wasn't a question. "And the girl?" Victoria asked. 6, doll, brave. He studied her for a breath, measuring whether this was a question from the kind of person who used children like weather or the kind who noticed them when it wasn't useful. She dragged me out the door, he said finally. Wouldn't take no, kept the pressure on his head, didn't let go. His mouth tilted. If I didn't believe in angels before, I might now. What's her name? Victoria asked, although she already knew. Grace, he said softly, as if the word might fly if spoken too loud. Comes and goes. Sits under the lamp-post when they won't let her in. Feeds a stray dog like it's part of a bargain she made with the universe. Rusty? Victoria asked, surprising herself. Looks like a Rusty, Eli said, then blinked as if re-seeing her. Lady, are you going to help her? Or put her on TV? I'm going to take her to him, Victoria said, and the certainty in her voice left no room for the other possibilities. He slid a napkin across the counter. 4 lines drawn on it quickly, the diner door, the lamp-post, the bench, the angles of approach from the ER bay. She'll be here when the dinner rush gives up, he said. She trusts this place. Victoria left a card pinned under the salt shaker and a tip that made Marge lift an eyebrow and grunt approval. If she comes in before I'm back, call me, Victoria said. Marge nodded the way women nod when they have already decided they will do a thing, and the conversation about it is a formality. Evening fell the way it always falls in hospital districts, fast, on a schedule, washing color out of the brick and giving the glass back its night face. The lamppost hummed as if it had thoughts about electricity, and the bench wore the damp like a habit. Rusty appeared first, a sly shadow sorting scents and deciding which belonged to him. He nosed toward the curb, snagged a crust of something he would later pretend not to have eaten. When the diner bell clanged, he lifted his head. Grace slipped into the street's edge light the way shy creatures slip into water, ready to run, compelled to cross. Her hoodie hung heavy with day-old rain. The doll, tucked under her arm, had the kind of wear that only comes from being loved hard in hard places. When Victoria stepped from the shadow of the oak, Grace stopped dead, every muscle going bright with the idea of flight. You don't need to run, Victoria said, palms visible, voice level. She had learned long ago that power looks different when you lower it to a child's height. My name is Victoria. I work for Mr. Sterling. Grace's mouth parted, closed, opened again. The hospital threw rectangles of light onto the sidewalk like invitations she'd already had refused. He remembers? She asked, unsure if the word could exist outside her own head. More than remembers, Victoria said, and the truth in it warmed her own throat. He's been asking for you. Rusty wagged once, as if endorsing the claim. Grace's hand moved to his head automatically, fingers burrowing into fur that needed a better brush and a safer life. She looked back at the diner, at the door that had let her in when other doors would not, then up at the hospital, which had behaved exactly like a fortress all day. She swallowed, the sound audible in the hush. I promised, she said, as if reminding herself and the night what came next. She straightened as tall as 6 allows and took a breath that sounded like a first step. May I? Victoria asked, extending a hand. She didn't reach for the doll. Grace hesitated. It wasn't distrust, quite. It was the body's memory of people who had given orders first and names last. Then she set her small damp palm into Victoria's, and found that the hand holding hers was warm and steady and not in a hurry. They crossed the street together. The sidewalk's cracks had memorized the shuffle of ER family shoes. The automatic doors, those breathtaking glass lungs, opened without the soft argument they had offered all day. At the desk, Ava looked up, saw the pairing, and tipped her chin down to hide the smile she couldn't quite scrub off her mouth. "Back again," Ava said to Grace. The leaf clips threw constellations across the counter. "I brought her," Victoria said simply. She didn't flash a credential or drop a name. She had learned that the quiet use of a relationship travels farther than the loud one. Mr. Sterling asked. "Sergeant Owens is on the door," Ava said, as if that settled everything. "He'll be expecting you." They moved down halls that hummed with machine agreement. The elevator mirrored them back. A woman whose posture had been trained by years of rooms that demanded it. A child whose shoulders carried promises a building full of adults had to learn to see. Grace watched their reflections like they were characters in a story other people got to read. On the 5th floor, the lights dimmed to a tone that hospitals use to convince your body it might sleep. The carpet caught their footsteps and held them. A nurse with a chart glanced up and then away again, sensing in one heartbeat that something important and unrepeatable was happening and that it required silence. At the end of the corridor, a uniformed guard stood by a heavy door whose plaque held a name that spent its days on screens and contract headers. Sergeant Cal Owens, older than Nate, weight in his stance that said he had stood between worse and better many times, took in the scene quickly. Victoria's face, a child's hand in hers, a doll tucked like a heart, the dog that wasn't allowed hovering hopefully at the elevator doors until they closed again. "Miss Langford," he said, stepping aside. His voice had the authority of a man who could lift iron but chose words instead. He looked at Grace without making her feel measured. "You've been on our list," he said. "Good to see you at the right door." Grace nodded, a small bow of respect in return for being seen. Her palm went slick in Victoria's, and Victoria squeezed once more, a signal that these 6 inches of carpet were not a test she could fail. "Ready?" Victoria whispered. "I've been ready all day," Grace said, and surprised them both. The door opened with the soft complaint of hospital hinges. The room smelled clean in that high, bright way that tries to convince you pain can be tidied. Machines kept time with thin, authoritative beeps. Morning's harsh white had softened to honey along the blinds. Alexander Sterling lay stiller than any boardroom man had ever been, color working its slow way back into his skin, edges of bandage peeking from his hairline like a clumsy crown. He woke to the sound of the door. People assume pain wakes you violently, but sometimes it's a practiced ascent, eyes lifting to the surface like divers who know the difference between speed and safety. His gaze clicked onto the frame and then past it, ignoring the adult shapes until it found the small one that held his attention with the gravity of something earned. "Angel," he said, voice scratched down to the grain. It wasn't a pet name, it was a recognition. Grace stopped as if the word had reached out and steadied her by the shoulders. Tears rose and didn't fall. She took 2 steps, then a third, stitched together out of every time she had been turned away and refused to add this time to the count. "I told you I'd find you," she whispered, voice bright and thin as thread. He held out a hand that had carried pens worth more than some cars, and today weighed the same as any hand that wanted to hold on. She slid her fingers into his. For a second, the room was only skin and skin, promise meeting promise with the profound practicality of pressure. His eyes softened into relief she felt in her sternum like a change in weather. Behind them, Victoria stood very still. She had been in rooms where acquisitions worth billions twisted people's faces into victory and loss. She had not seen a transaction this simple undo anyone so completely. Something unclenched under her ribs, small and unexpectedly disobedient. A nurse appeared, looked once, and began to retreat the way you move when you know you're intruding on something that belongs only to the people touching hands. Alexander lifted his chin a fraction. "She stays," he said. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They arrived in the room and quietly rearranged what authority meant inside it. "Understood," the nurse said, surprised into a smile that belonged to her before it belonged to the hospital. Grace dragged a chair closer with a squeal she tried to apologize for and couldn't quite, because breathing had become a task big enough for the moment. She sat so near their arms could make a small bridge. Her doll lay in her lap, eyes to the ceiling like a witness sworn in. "They didn't let me in," she said, the hurt of the day shrinking to its real size now that it had a place to sit. "I tried. I said I promised." "I know," he said, and there was a gratitude in the phrase that made it sound like relief. "I kept thinking, what if she tries and can't and thinks I forgot?" His mouth crooked. "I didn't." Victoria stepped closer, the clicking of her heels softened by carpet and the decision to be gentle. "She never stopped trying," she said, answering both of them and perhaps herself. "She sat outside where she could see your window and refused to go missing." Grace swiped the heel of her hand across her cheek and allowed the smallest smile. "Rusty and me," she said, "we took turns keeping watch." "Rusty?" Alexander asked. "A dog," Victoria answered, because the details mattered, and because telling them felt like putting a stone in a cairn you wanted strangers to find their way by. "Brown, thin, loyal. Then we're 3, Alexander said, and the math arranged itself into something like comfort. The monitors made their tidy arguments for order. Outside the glass, the city continued to commit its daily mistakes at volume. Inside, the room practiced a different law. Grace leaned forward, elbows near the rail, and the doll's yarn hair tickled her wrist. She lowered her voice as if sharing a secret with someone who had already earned it. "I kept my promise," she said. He nodded, a small movement that cost him and that he gave anyway. "So did I," he said. For a while, that was enough. Questions about what came next, papers and placements and the ways a country builds fences around children even when it wants to help them, waited their turn outside the door. Victoria let them. She stood with her hands folded where Grace could see them and not be startled, and she watched the way the child's shoulders settled as belonging did its work. When the nurse returned to check a line, she asked if Grace needed anything. "Water?" the nurse suggested. "A blanket?" Grace shook her head, then changed her mind. "A blanket," she said, because warm felt like a word she might be allowed to use now. The nurse tucked a thin hospital throw around her, a small ceremony that tasted like arrival. Alexander's eyes drifted and found her again, the way they had in the road's wet dark. "You held my hand," he said, not a question. "I'll hold it now," she answered, and did. At the threshold, Sergeant Owens looked in once, took the measure of the scene, and redirected a reporter who had begun to orbit too close. Back at the front desk, Ava tapped a note into the system that would never be official, but would move the right people into the right places at the right times. Grace with Mr. S, all okay. In the diner, Eli refilled a coffee he didn't need and found himself staring at the phone like he could will it to ring with news that would let him unclench his own jaw. Even Rusty, somewhere between the bushes and the bench, barked once into the evening and then settled, as if dogs, too, know when a story has briefly landed on a true sentence. "Thank you," Alexander said finally, and the word carried less like gratitude and more like a title he intended to speak often. Grace blinked hard, then nodded, because sometimes nodding is the only way to keep from breaking apart in public. The doll slid in her lap, and she caught it with a hand that didn't let go of his. "I'm here," she said, and the phrase, simple as it was, sounded like the day turning. Near the foot of the bed, Victoria exhaled for what felt like the first time since the crash. She straightened her jacket, not to posture, but to put the world back on in an order she could carry. There would be calls to return. A statement to shape that protected without stealing. Doors to hold open that had slammed all day. But for the moment, the work that mattered had already been done, and not by her. She stepped back toward the threshold, catching Alexander's eye for a beat. He didn't say, "Thank you." The room had already been filled with the right kind of gratitude, but he nodded in a way that acknowledged roles honestly played. She nodded back in a language they had built between them over 100 crises, where you learned which actions earned words and which actions retired them. In the chair, Grace let her head tilt toward the bed rail, the blanket rising and falling with small breaths. Her fingers, still nested in his, relaxed, but did not release. The machine beeps smoothed to something almost like a lullaby. The light through the blinds turned from honey to amber to the first blue of a night that would be kinder than the last one. "She stays," Alexander had said, and the sentence continued to hold the room in place. Outside, the hospital's doors kept taking the city in and giving it back. Inside, a girl who had been invisible met the eyes of a man who had been untouchable, and both of them, briefly, were only human and safe enough to admit it. Victoria closed the door to a whisper and took the first step towards the corridor. For now, the world could knock and be made to wait. The right door had finally opened. The hospital never truly slept. It murmured in monitors, whispered in shoe squeaks, sighed in ventilation ducts. Yet in Alexander Sterling's room, there was a stillness that carried its own gravity. Grace Miller sat perched on the chair beside his bed, her doll tucked against her stomach, the thin hospital blanket wrapped over her shoulders. She had not let go of his hand, not once, not even in sleep. By the second week, color had returned to his face. His voice was steadier, though every word cost him. The staff had grown used to the sight of her, a small girl with tangled hair and fierce eyes who belonged here, though nobody could explain why. Some nurses smiled softly when they passed, others frowned and muttered about strays. But Alexander's simple command, "She stays," silenced every challenge before it grew teeth. Outside the walls of the ICU, the world argued about her. News anchors speculated, headlines demanded answers, columnists scoffed. Mystery child, street scam, angel or con artist. The questions multiplied, louder than facts. Cameras crowded the sidewalks, each reporter hungry for the soundbite that would prove they knew the truth. Inside, Alexander had decided enough was enough. "Bring them in," he told Victoria one evening, his voice low but resolute. "No more shadows. I'll tell them myself." Victoria's brows lifted. She had seen billionaires address hostile boards with less conviction. "You're not strong enough for a press conference," she warned. "Then a broadcast," Alexander countered. His eyes flicked to Grace, who sat silently beside him, clutching her doll. "She shouldn't live under their suspicion. She saved me. I'll give her back her name." And so it happened. Cameras rolled in his hospital room, their lights harsh against pale walls. Victoria orchestrated everything, keeping the chaos at bay. Alexander leaned back against his pillows, breath shallow but steady, his hand clasping Grace's small one. She sat half-hidden until he tugged gently and brought her into the frame. "This child," he said, his voice husky but carrying, "is not a rumor. She's not a scam. She's the reason I'm alive." The room stilled. Even the camera operators forgot to breathe. Alexander's gaze burned into the lens. "When I lay broken on the side of County Road 17, no one stopped. Cars passed. Strangers looked away. But she stayed. She pressed her sleeve to my head. She held my hand, and she whispered a promise she never broke. Her name is Grace Miller. Remember it. I will remember it for the rest of my life. The broadcast cut across every channel, across social feeds and news tickers. Within hours, Grace's name was no longer a rumor. It was a story the world couldn't ignore. Grace Miller, the girl who saved a billionaire. For Grace, the change was dizzying. Strangers looked at her with awe, not dismissal. Donations poured into charities in her name. But at night, when the hospital quieted and the cameras left, she whispered into her doll's frayed cloth, "I didn't do it for that. I just didn't want him to die alone." Weeks stretched into months. Alexander's strength grew. Physical therapy made him grit his teeth, but Grace's quiet encouragement became his anchor. Victoria arranged for Grace's schooling, though Grace resisted at first, fearful that leaving meant losing her place. But Alexander reassured her. "Education is a promise I'll keep for you. You kept yours for me." Rusty was brought to the hospital gardens after Victoria heard of him. The day Grace saw the dog trot across the grass, cleaner and wagging, she laughed so hard it startled the nurses. She hugged him fiercely, whispering, "We're safe now." Rusty licked her face as if agreeing. By the time Alexander was well enough to leave, the world had shifted around them. Invitations arrived daily. Charity events, interviews, meetings with foundations. Most he ignored. But one evening, he told Grace they would attend one together. The charity gala gleamed beneath the glass dome of the downtown museum. Dresses shimmered like spilled jewels. Diamonds flashed under chandeliers. The murmur of wealth rolled like distant thunder. Yet, all eyes found the man with the cane, and the small girl at his side, holding his hand with a grip stronger than any jewel. Her doll was tucked neatly under her arm, ribbon tied freshly around its yarn hair. Alexander stepped to the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Months ago," he began, "I lay on a road, broken, waiting for the world to pass me by. And it did, but one person stopped. A child with nothing to her name, dismissed by many as invisible. She gave me something no wealth could buy, her courage." His eyes fell to Grace, who tightened her hold on the doll and lifted her chin. "I call her my angel," Alexander continued, "but she is proof of something larger. Greatness isn't measured by money or power. It is measured by the heart to act when others turn away." The applause erupted, echoing against glass and steel. Grace's cheeks burned, but she felt the anchor of his hand steady her. He leaned down and whispered, "They'll never forget you again." Then, as the applause dimmed, a silence fell. Grace stepped forward, small voice trembling but clear. "I just didn't want him to die alone. I promised I'd find him again." The hush that followed was deeper than clapping, a silence that meant every heart in the room had been reached. Tears shone in eyes that had not known want, faces softened that had been carved from ambition. Applause rose again, a wave that lifted her higher than chandeliers. Rusty barked near the stage, tail wagging as laughter rippled through the hall. Grace knelt, scratching his ears, her laughter bright, ringing, alive. For the first time, she felt it settle inside her. She was no longer invisible. Not a shadow, not a mystery. Grace Miller had become a voice, an answer, an angel. She clutched her doll, whispered softly, "We kept our promise." And Alexander, cane planted firm, leaned toward her and said words the world would never erase. "This is your world too now, Grace, and you will never be forgotten." No one is truly invisible when courage speaks louder than silence. If Grace's story touched you, like this video, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who believes in hope. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from.